Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming to tonight's archaeology talk entitled Beneath the Floorboards, Archaeology at Jerusalem Mills. So really quickly, I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Allison, and I'm a librarian at St. Mary's County Library. Um, Tonight's speaker is Dr. Jim Gibb. Okay, Jim, are you ready?
I am ready.
Fantastic.
Okay, well, welcome everybody. It's good to see some old friends on the screen. Uh, we're broadcasting to Georgia and Florida and who knows where else today. So, yeah, tonight I want to talk about some work that we've been doing. The SEAL team has been doing up at Jerusalem Mills, which is in Harford County. Uh, a lot of the SEAL participation has actually been in the lab, including Linda Perkins, who cataloged most, if not all, of the artifact assemblage. I think I left her off my acknowledgments. Anyway, that's that's just for me. That's my abstract. Remind me what I'm talking about. Okay, so I want to start. Let's start a little bit with Jerusalem Mill, just a little bit of what the place looks like. I will go into its history in great depth, in part because that would be a talk on it in and of itself. And also, I don't know its history in depth, so I'm not able to do that. So, for those of you who are in faraway states like Florida and Georgia, this is the great state of Maryland. Uh, and the Jerusalem Mill Village is up in Harford County, represented by that red dot there. So up north of Baltimore. Close-up view using a U.S. Geological Survey map. You can see I've got subject area on there, actually focuses on the house that we're going to deal with, but that's the village largely on the east bank of the little Gunpowder Falls. I will draw your attention to the right of that. There's a number of purple things in purple. These are all new construction. I don't recall offhand what the map dates to, but probably since the 1990s. There's been some residential development around this historic village, but it still retains its rural ambience. And it's really a beautiful, it's part of the Gunpowder Falls State Park. It's really a beautiful place to visit, interesting place, and it's not too hard to get to, not too far of the way. Google aerial photograph of the area. Uh, there are a number of buildings indicated, including the Gunpowder Falls State Park headquarters, which is in the restored mill south of Jerusalem Road. I'm going to be talking about the Lee-Pullen House in the middle and then the field just next to it. But let me show you some of the sites around the park. The so-called gun factory, which was actually sort of a carpenter shop, cooperage. Its function changed over the years. I think it was even a dwelling at one point. But it's interesting for this site because local lore has it that they were manufacturing gun stocks for muskets for for the Revolutionary War patriots. We haven't investigated that at all. To my mind, that's not hasn't been confirmed, but it's an interesting thing to look into. We have a store, general store, McCourtney's, uh, which I think has a gift shop in it now. I've never actually been inside of it. And the restored mill. Supposedly, there was a mill on the site completed in 1772. Again, I don't have the deep history of this site. I suspect this is not the original or it's been greatly expanded. But it was a substantial mill and milling mostly wheat, flour that would be shipped to the Caribbean, perhaps even to Europe. It's what's referred to as a merchant mill. For those of you who attended my talk I don't know when, on mill sites that talk a lot about merchant mills versus mills that are really for local consumption, where they're just, grinding grain to order for local farmers. But this is a merchant mill, so this stuff was being shipped out. The mill works are largely gone, but you can see where the uh, uh, wheel once stood, and also how see where it was replaced by turbines. And that was very common in the late 19th century for these mills to switch to a new technology where the machine was basically manufactured and just installed, as opposed to earlier mill wheels where you need a skilled millwright, part of the de-skilling of the American workforce. One of the houses, I think this is referred to the tenant house, I'm not sure, but it's a classic cross gable, two-story house, three bay. Uh, you see it's not very big. You can see how wide it is, at least the main part. And it's a very common architectural style throughout the Mid-Atlantic area. The blacksmith shop, which I got to say, I was inside. The curator, Rich Albright, had taken me through, and it's a big blacksmith shop. Yeah, I've never seen one that size. And it too probably underwent certain, other functions over the years. And just a shot that I stole from somewhere of the interior. This is big. I mean, look at uh, two anvils in there. There's all kinds. It's a large space, a lot of storage. My guess is they were working on wheeled vehicles in there too. Um, okay. And also the covered bridge just kind of south of the village. One of the few, I think there are about a half dozen covered bridges surviving in Maryland. I gave a talk about this earlier this year, and I think I illustrated this one. Again, I think I stole this photograph too. Um, Lighting is really tough in there, but this is a Burr Arch Truss Bridge. You can see an arch on each side, along with these simple king post trusses, I'm sorry. But it's still active bridge. You can drive over it. An older photograph, it gives you a little better sense of the context. And finally, not finally, there are other buildings around, but a barn that is a ruin now, but is in the process of being restored. Okay, so what I really wanted to talk about tonight was our excavations at the Lee-Pullen House. Um, if you could see over to the far left is the Jerusalem Mill. Again, that's where the Park Service office is today. The blacksmith across the street, tenant house, and then the Lee-Pullen House. Uh, and then the bridge is south of all this. But this is what I'm going to focus on, the house here and the field. And I'll start with the field because we did this. The Friends of Jerusalem Mills are restoring this house. And so that's why we were there doing some archaeology. But since we were there, there's this lovely field next door, sometimes used for overflow parking, with a possible crop mark indicating where there was another building. And it does show up on a late 19th century map as the uh, Lee House, I think. So while we were out there, we had a metal detector team come out, and they metal detected this whole field, flagged it, pin flagged it, and then I just sketched in the concentrations. To give you a sense, the picture is taken from the Lee-Pullen House, again, where we're digging. And there's quite a stretch here. You can see the store in the background. There are orange flags all over the place. These are the hits that the metal detector team came up with. And here they are at work. It was kind of a cold day, I think. Now, one of the nice things about working inside the Pullen House, the Lee-Pullen House, is that it had electric lights and it was heated. It was downright comfortable. But these guys went out and did a fabulous job. I've got their names there. I think that's all of them. Um, Flagging, and again, I just had to sketch in the concentrations where they found material. And it does look like there's at least one building out there and possibly two. But this is a old photograph of the Lee-Pullen House. The portion on the left is where we were digging inside. That's Rich Albright, who is the curator on the left. I think that's Kyle Hayward standing up, the blue shirt in the excavation, and then Dan Coates from the Archaeological Society of the Northern Chesapeake, uh, a chapter of the Archaeological Society of Maryland. So that chapter actually provided a fair amount of labor, as did the Friends. And the Friends also provided fabulous hot lunches for us. This is the way to go. So when we first, this actually happened over several days. We had to get permission from the Maryland Historical Trust to proceed. And, they're fairly conservative. They didn't want us digging the place up, and they wanted to, if there's something to preserve for future research, they want us to keep it intact. So initially, we dug just two excavation units on either side of the hearth that serves the existing kitchen addition to the building. And you could see, well, the screens are not there, but you could see we were screening inside the building. And then Rich and his folks, basically after we left, I think shoveled that stuff out the window and moved it somewhere else. So here's another view. This is actually a little from the second day we were out there, I don't know, a month or so later, where they removed more of the floorboards and exposed more for us to do a little more digging. The interesting thing initially, the first day, was we were digging these units. This is the one to the left of the hearth. And we came down on a stone foundation that had absolutely nothing to do with the existing building. I guess that's the sort of thing we should have been looking for, but it isn't necessarily what I expected. But clearly it's evidence of an earlier building. And this is that same bit of foundation, that same excavation unit. And I've made it easy for you and for me. I labeled it so I don't have to forget. But we've got that earlier foundation. We have a bunch of stone fill on the other side. That foundation ends at the current west wall foundation for the kitchen. We could not determine where this earlier foundation goes. Has it been embedded in the foundation of the extant kitchen? Or did it extend beyond that? And maybe the west wall of the earlier building is outside the current building. That's something we can look for. Here's our initial map of the units. Unit 1 is up to the left of the hearth, Unit 2 to the right. And when we came back, we did Units 3 and 4 straddling that foundation, which I've just projected. I haven't actually drawn it in. The whole point of doing this work is that in order to restore the building, they need to replace the existing heating system, or at least the ductwork. And the old HVAC duct was in terrible condition. And so, but we had to remove the floorboards to get to it. And so the construction people can remove it. And that's how we found the foundation. There are builders' trenches, both for the original building and for the newer building. That's what those arrows point to. And we also dug a little sort of dog hole in one corner, and I'll get back to that at the end of the talk. So here's some of our team working. To the left is the hearth. And rather curiously, it seems to have this iron plate on it. I've not seen that before. But it sits, that edge of the hearth sits on top of the foundation of the earlier building. And what these guys are doing is they're troweling back, trying to expose, we're looking first of all for a hearth. Presumably this addition was heated and possibly was an earlier kitchen, in which case it should have a fireplace. It's possible that the existing fireplace sits on top of the original. And I don't really know of any way of figuring that out, short of dismantling that hearth, which I'm sure a lot of folks would not like me to do. So we won't be doing that. But where Dan and Kyle are excavating, I think there's some burn material down here. There's some charcoal suggesting a possible hearth, and also just uh, up by the foundation, up by the hearth, there was also a patch of burn soil and charcoal. Either one of those things could suggest an earlier hearth. So here's pretty much how we left it, I think. The third time we were out there, all the floorboards had been removed, so we had ready access. Those floorboards are stored. I don't know, they may have been put back by now, but they were stored. They have been stored with the hope that we can replace the floor with them. But you could see our units here, and you can see with this reddish material, reddish brown, uh, and these little specks over here. That suggests a possible hearth, that we're up near a hearth, because it's not just charcoal, but the soil is actually reddened by heat. Again, is that original fireplace completely gone, or is it embedded within the existing hearth? And the same thing with the west wall. You could see the wall cutting across here. This is the foundation, the north foundation wall for that earlier building. And it stops when it hits the west wall of the existing building. So it may well be embedded, it may have been used for the new building, or it may extend beyond, and we could find it outside. I think that's all I wanted to say about that. Yeah, here you could see, this is, let me go back for just a second. This cluster of stones here, which I don't know what they're doing there. It might be part of a central pier support that's collapsed, but it's got charcoal around it too, as you can see here. The soil isn't reddened, but there is charcoal. You know, is this possibly part of an interior hearth? I don't know. You got to figure when the original building was dismantled, they probably cannibalized a lot of the stone for the newer structure. So the earlier one's not going to be in great shape. And again, that same from a different perspective, you can see over to the right that natural yellowish brown clay soil with a bunch of charcoal on top of it. In terms of artifacts, we did find this. Never mind the cable there, just this large T-shaped thing. This is name escapes me, but this is the sort of thing that's set into a fireplace. And this long piece here spins in and out, so you can hang a kettle on it and swing it back over the coals. And when you want to check the contents, you could swing it back again. So this was not buried. This was within the building. Is it original? And what do we mean by that? Is it original to the existing kitchen addition? Or is it something somebody put in, in the last 20 years or so as just an antique that goes nicely with the fireplace? Or could it have been original? It could have been part of the original kitchen addition. We don't know. But
So
we did a lot.
sorry to interrupt. There's a comment in the chat. Linda says that's a crane.
Crane, thank you. Um, it's not that my memory is deteriorating. It's just that I managed a lot of different projects. It's hard to keep everything straight. So we did a lot of screening. This is Pete Morrow from the Department of Natural Resources. He's very well versed in the architecture of this building. It's an architectural puzzle, and I don't mean just the addition we're in. The entire structure has multiple episodes of repair and alteration, and um, I haven't gone through the plans to see if I could figure it out, but Pete, I think, is on the job. But we screened a lot. Obviously, I didn't take this picture. And I just threw this in here, just to give you a sense of how much material we got from 7 excavation units, all measuring 5 foot by 5 foot or less. So on the left-hand side, we have a total of over 4,000 artifacts. Again, Linda Perkins um, cataloged all that material. Almost 2,000 of them, 1,933 were from vessels, that is ceramic and glass vessel sherds. Another quarter, a little over 1,000, shows up as food. Mostly that's bone from meals. In terms of the ceramics, which are our best means of dating the building, we've got quite a collection there. But most of the material there, particularly pearlware and creamware, dipped whitewares, edgewares, jackfield, they all kind of suggest very late 18th century, but probably more early 19th century. A lot of stuff like, creamware was available since the 1760s, but it took a while to make it over to the colonies, and people have to buy it, they have to use it, and then they have to break it and throw it out. So manufacturing may have begun in 1767, but a piece like that may not have been bought for several years afterwards, and then remained in somebody's kitchen for many years before finally being broken. But the artifacts in general suggest a very late 18th or more likely early 19th century. Remember, the village was formed, local lore has it, in the late 18th century, the 1770s, just before the Revolution, as largely became a Quaker village. So this doesn't suggest the earliest building on the site, but it's pretty early. And the list of ceramics, one of the things that's missing is white salt glazed stoneware. Very nice, looks like plates we have today, but it's made of stoneware, very thinly potted. It is absent, and that's a classic 18th century ceramic that shows up on all sites from certainly the mid 18th century to about 1800. So the fact that it's absent suggests that uh, it isn't an 18th century site. Also, I don't think we have very little, if any, tin glazed earthenware. That's also 18th century. So for now, I'm going to say very early, the first decade of the 19th century. Two of the artifacts we found are rather curious. These are pieces of slate. And the larger piece, just towards the center, has a hole in it. These are roofing slates, and they suggest that the building at one time was roofed with slate. But we only found two pieces. I think, one of the explanations would be that we're digging inside the building. We probably shouldn't find, roofing in the building. We would expect to find it around the building. But that's something that could be looked for in any archaeology that occurs around the building. Do we find the remains of slate roofing? That gives us, again, gives us some information on how that building was built. We get a lot of bone and it's beautifully preserved. We have a prospective new member of the SEAL team who is interested in learning faunal material, and tell her, well, you can work on this collection. And it's a really good one because it was inside the building, so it's not all mashed up and weathered the way a lot of our bone usually is. So it's in really beautiful shape. These are the left and right mandibles from a pig, the lower jaw. I don't know if they're from this. They look like they're probably from the same pig, judging from the premolars and molars, but I didn't actually try to put them together. Your mandible, your jaw, is actually two bones that fuse in the middle, and that's true of all mammals and birds too. One of the things we found a lot of, and I'm talking here about the bones over in the left 2/3 of the screen. These are all rodent bones, and they're almost certainly wood rat or pack rat. You may, yeah. Um, they a lot of the bone may have been brought into the building by pack rats. I don't know. One of the odd things, one of the curious things about this building and many others like it is when we find a lot of trash underneath the building, and really nasty, smelly trash, pig bones, fish, oysters. What's this stuff doing inside of a building that's still standing? If the building had been demolished, then you could say, yeah, it's the neighbors, it was a convenient place to go throw their trash. but in a building that's still standing. It is rather curious why we find this stuff. But there are a lot of rodent remains. Once we do the faunal analysis, when we identify the elements and taxa for all the bones, one of the things we'll look carefully at is, are these bones extensively rodent gnawed? And rodent gnawing on bones is really obvious. It just shows up very sharp little grooves in those upper incisors. So we'll need to look at that. To the right, upper right, those are bird bones. A lot of the assemblage is from bird. And I think a lot of the bird, I mean, there's clearly some chicken in there and turkey, but it looks like, to me, a lot of the bird, just impressionistically, is game birds. And so identifying taxa will allow us to get some sense of what kinds of birds were around there when these deposits were forming. It's even possible to find passenger pigeon in deposits like these. Passenger pigeons have been extinct since around 1900. So it might be something we look for. In the lower right-hand corner, there's your classic oyster shell, and there's a mussel, and these are saltwater species clearly brought in. But also present, and the lower of the three is yellow lance mussel. These are freshwater mussels. The Linnaean term is Elliptio lanceolata. They're becoming exceedingly rare in the Chesapeake drainage because of pollution, mostly, I suppose. Um, they show up in very small numbers on sites, even in the 17th century. I spoke about dietary practices in the 17th century based on a bunch of sites that I'd excavated over the years some months ago. Um, and we did find Liptia in a number of those deposits, just, one, two, three, I think we had 15 was the largest number in a mid-18th century site. So again, there's some possibility of looking at the changing local ecology. Lots of ceramics, as I mentioned, about half of the artifacts and bone that were recovered were ceramics. And they come in a fair variety, but uh, I would imagine few of you know very much about period ceramics, but these are pretty classic early 19th century ones. We got various sorts of blue-edged pearlwares, and these could date back into the 18th century, especially the one in the lower right left-hand corner. Large piece of creamware, this nice big white, I guess that would be an octagonal dish. Uh, on the other hand, this large blue-edged piece in the upper right, yeah, that's much later. It's a whiteware, and it's probably close to the mid-19th century, as are these transfer prints down below. These are European made, but a large number of the ceramics have Oriental motifs, which is kind of interesting. I mean, why were the people who were living there, what attracted them to that? I mean, clearly they had these classic Staffordshire edged wares in green and blue, and at some point switched over to these transfer prints showing Oriental designs, Asian designs. Um, one of the things we can do, we haven't done this with the ceramics, is actually look at design motifs. For folks who are restoring the house, having examples of this material, you can go out and buy. I imagine you get reproductions, but you could buy antique, complete, um, well-preserved examples. So if you furnish the house, you can furnish it with the materials for which we have evidence that the house was furnished with these things. And of course, they tell us a lot about what the deposits date to. Just a few more. Upper left, there's some dipped wares, white ware and yellow wares. Again, 19th century. Lower right, we've got, oh, there is a bit of tin glaze here. We have some tin glazed earthenware, these top two in the lower left-hand quadrant. Again, that's a classic 18th century ceramic, but if that's all we have from those excavations, then again, it's not likely we have a solid 18th century occupation. You'll see also next to more Asian design transfer printed. A spongeware cup, uh, mid-19th century, I'd say, more Asian design over on the right-hand side. We also recovered what's probably pieces of a single tobacco pipe, and I didn't have a ready one in my collection, so I uh, just scanned these this afternoon just to pop it. It's not the exact same design, but this gives you a sense of what that pipe bowl would have looked like complete. An example, the photographic, the one I stole is kind of an early 19th century design. We found two bone tools. The lower one is nice and polished, got a hole in it for a rivet. This is almost certainly for a piece of tableware, a fork, a spoon, something like that. The one above it is a classic bone toothbrush, missing the one half, and of course the pig bristles would have been put in, but it's a classic toothbrush. So yeah, a little bit of evidence of personal hygiene. Not a huge number of buttons, but they're an interesting collection. The one on the far left isn't a button; it's a glass bead, and so is the small one next to it. But the rest are buttons, and of course the thimble there. I don't know what that washer-like thing is. I think it's made of shell. Uh, but a number of these are shell buttons, which fits in nicely with some of the research Seal has been doing. I talked about this in the series, shell button making. These are probably pre-industrial shell button making. Shell buttons have been made for eons, but probably starting around the 1880s, 1890s, it was done on more of an industrial basis in the United States. And I don't think these are examples of that. Bones, people scavenge bones. Specialists who would collect bones mostly in urban environments from people's trash. They set them aside and they clean them up and cut them and polish them and turn them on a lathe to make nice buttons. You can see the one in the middle is somewhat less than symmetrical, um, not quality work. The one with the small hole in it, um, it's very likely that this, and maybe the others as well, but certainly this one were covered with fabric. And so that's what the hole was for, is for securing and sewing on the fabric. And then that fabric would be sewed to the garment. So some initial observations. This is an ongoing project, not necessarily with me involved, but there's a lot of archaeology to be done around the house to learn about it. But also, yeah, this is a mill village that just predates the American Revolution. Uh, I'm sure everybody's aware that next year marks, well, next April marks the first shots fired at Lexington and Concord, April of 2025, 250 years. The following year is the semi-quincentennial of the Declaration of Independence. So folks are slowly but beginning to gear up to look at the Revolutionary War. As I've stated before in past talks, I started in archaeology in 1976 for the bicentennial. And I tell you, there was so much movement at the time, and especially several years leading up to it. Big celebrations, bicentennial communities were designated. Most of the guidelines for doing architectural history and archaeology were developed in connection with the bicentennial. A lot of money put into it. It was a huge thing. We're nothing near right now what we were doing 50 years ago. But there's a lot of eve of the revolution work that could be done at Jerusalem Mills. There's a community that was formed, a mill community just prior to the revolution. There's archaeology all over the place. We're not going to find evidence of battles. We're probably not even going to find evidence of gun stocks being manufactured for muskets. But what we will get is a sense of what that village was like on the eve of the revolution. There are mill villages that dotted, the countryside. These were basically one step below the regular urban places of Annapolis and such. So there's a lot of work that could be done there. But in any case, what we found through very limited effort, really, I think we spent 3 days in the field, maybe four, I don't recall. But we found the earlier building. In fact, some of those days we only worked in the morning because we accomplished what we needed to accomplish so quickly. But we've got an earlier building. We're not absolutely we don't have good solid evidence of how it functioned. Was it in fact a kitchen wing to the building subsequently replaced? The artifacts suggest at this point that it's very, very early 19th century. And keep in mind too, early 19th century, that's the time of the Napoleonic Wars, and Thomas Jefferson eventually embargoing trade with Great Britain and France. So you got to wonder, is any of that reflected in the archaeology? Do we see an uptick in the appearance of locally manufactured red earthenware? Something to look for. The west wall of this addition, I don't recall the size of this thing. I think it's something like 14 by 12. I don't recall the dimensions, but we have um, three walls. We don't have the west wall. We don't know if it's incorporated into the newer west wall or if it extends outside of it, in which case the new kitchen addition was probably bigger than the earlier one, but perhaps not as wide. It was, yeah, not as wide. So, and that's work that could be done very easily, just going to the west side of the building outside and poking around a little bit, an excavation unit, maybe even a shovel test pit. Inside the building, there are a large number of artifacts and bones. And we run into this a lot on sites. And it begs the question, what is all this trash doing inside a building that was still occupied? It had to smell bad. Is it possible that it was dumped in uh, when it wasn't smelling so bad, shoveled in from outside as some sort of fill? I mean, I can't say. I mean, it's possible. The bones, when we get into the analysis of the bones, we'll see if they've been weathered, if they've been outside. And my impression is they have not. They have been in a protected environment. Again, with the avian remains, we've probably got a number of wild, game birds in the collection. It'd be really interesting to see which ones, or some of if there are a number of different species of ducks, or all those ducks still present in the area. You go around now, but when you look uh, out on lakes in this area and ponds and whatnot, you see Canada geese and mallards. Um, an expert may see a lot of others, but certainly those two species really dominate the game bird populations of the Chesapeake these days. And again, that yellow lance mussel, it's only one, but it could easily have come out of a little gunpowder. Will we see more of that? What's it doing there? It's too small to eat. And that's the same thing I've seen on other colonial sites where, we find a few pieces of yellow lance shell, but they're too small for anybody to have been bothered with, and too few. Are they being used for fishing bait? Are they collected inadvertently while collecting something else? And if so, what else were they collecting? But that's, a question to pursue. The original building may have succumbed to flooding. And that might be the explanation why it was demolished and the addition was built. And let me just briefly show you the argument here. I showed you this drawing earlier and drew your attention to Unit 4 and this little test we have here, a little dog hole that we dug through the sediments. Yeah, we didn't do extensive excavation in this area. We just pretty much exposed the material under the floorboards because it's probably not going to be disturbed with the new duct system. So there's a limit to how much excavation we can justify, especially if we didn't have good questions in hand. We want to wait, at some future date, we can go back. Well, yank up the floorboards again. And by the way, this sort of parenthetically, there's a little vent. There's now a spigot, a water spigot that comes through the wall, and it comes through what used to be a vent, just a gap in the stone foundation that whoever put in the running water took advantage of that existing hole in the foundation. Directly across in the west wall, we found a similar one. These vents served a purpose, and that is they ventilated the space beneath the wooden floors. You want to do that partly to maintain a level of comfort, keep humidity down, and keep it from getting too cold or down there. But it also helped preserve the floorboards. You didn't get a lot of rot of those floorboards from moisture. Uh, at some point, those vents were filled in, and that actually created a problem under the building. They reduced the ventilation there. And I hope when they restore the building, they will restore those vents to allow air to flow through and keep that space drier. But getting back to Unit 4 and our little dog hole there, this is a photograph of what it looked like, what the sediments look like. And you could see a sort of a dark material and a lighter material, kind of ashy material. There's several different layers here down to this heavy silt here. This is the drawing. The clay loam, probably material that developed under the floorboards in relatively recent years. And then underneath that are two layers of very fine laminated sands and silts. And those could very well be water deposited. And underneath, and they're sitting on a clay loam. Soils develop out of the soil beneath. So, you go out in your front yard, dig a hole, you dig through the sod, you've got some dark topsoil, and you'll hit some sort of subsoil. Maybe it's sand, maybe it's clay, whatever. The topsoil developed out of that underlying soil, and so it should be very like that underlying soil in terms of texture. But here we've got these sandy silts that clearly did not develop out of that underlying clay loam. It looks like that clay loam was exposed when they built the building. I mean, they shoveled a hole in the ground. And so that would have been previously unseen by humans. These other deposits had to be transported into the building. And it's very possible, given how close we are to the little gunpowder, and I don't know much about its history, but I suspect it's overflowed its banks a time or two over the centuries. And so what we may be looking at are flood deposits that undermine the building, maybe even destroyed it, and then either created a need or maybe created an opportunity to make a bigger kitchen addition. Um, but it could suggest catastrophic flooding. So, that's what I have for this evening. I just want to thank the people who are really involved in uh, uh, making this happen. The beautiful lunches we had by the resident of the house, and Rich Albright, who's the curator, Dan Coates, who mustered up volunteers to help out. This was essentially a volunteer effort. Um, I got paid just enough so I didn't have to go through extra paperwork as a volunteer. I was a contractor, made life a little easier. And then Linda Perkins, who I neglected to put on the list, she did most, if not all, of the cataloging. And hopefully we'll have another volunteer listed on there soon who will have done the final analysis. And that's what I got. Any questions? Let's stop sharing so I can see you. So, what do you think?
Jim, I was
It's
curious about that charcoal. Is that something that looked like it had built up over a time, or could it have been a shovelful, or how did that appear to you?
it's kind of mixed into the soil and we see this a lot in different contexts in archaeology. It looks like the sort of thing where most of the ash had been cleaned up, and we're just seeing little bits of it that remain embedded in the soil. Um, and so, I mean, it could have been transported there. What's interesting is when we find that fire-reddened soil, that's not transported. That means there was heat there. So either there was a hearth there, or if it's extensive enough, the building burned. And we didn't find extensive reddening, just a patch of it near the existing hearth, but not associated with the existing hearth. It's a foot below. I my I'm guessing, I suspect that the original hearth is where the existing one is and was built over. And the alternative is that little cluster of rock in the middle where the charcoal you mentioned, is that was the base of a hearth and it was largely dismantled and the stone reused for the new addition. I wish there were simple answers to these questions. There aren't.
Jim, I have two questions. You can take them in whichever order you like. I may have missed this. How big a village? Do they have a map of how many structures there might have been there? That's the first question. Second question, when you showed the structure of the blacksmith shop, it looked like in the mortar there had been a smaller roof line.
Well, in terms of the map, I create a map downloading information from a geographic information system data from the county and the state. That's how I created the map with the buildings. But I really focused on the core of the village and I had not dealt with, what was beyond. But the parks people, I'm pretty sure they have a map for visitors. Um, and if they don't, we can make them one. It's not that hard. The blacksmith shop, no archaeology has been done on that, but yeah, that's almost certainly there was an addition to it. It's already a massive thing. Um, However, the curator knows more about the history of that building than I do, certainly. He did mention that it had undergone subsequent uses. I mean, it's big enough to use as a garage, a mechanical garage. But I
The original
suspect
roof line was very small, at least what I could see.
it's semi-subterranean and it has sort of a shed roof to it, but it encloses a very large bit of space for a blacksmith shop. I suspect it may have been used as a wheelwright shop, and there's room for a second floor. And carriage makers and wagon makers often would hoist their vehicles up to that second floor, which would have no windows, and that's where they would do the paint job. They're trying to avoid dust getting in, spoiling the paint job, so it's typically done on the second floor, a building with, often no windows or tightly sealed windows, because they put on primer and they put on a layer of paint and then they scour it and they put on another layer of paint and they scour it. And so they could have 20 coats of paint on a carriage, probably not on a wagon. So it's a really thick, almost enamel type surface. And I could see them having done that in that shop. Did I answer all that well enough?
I'd give you a B.
Okay, all right. I'll work harder next time for you, Josepha.
I wanted to point out that in the chat, Rich posted village information is available at jerusalemmill.org in case
Mhm.
anybody wants to visit that website.
Yeah, I actually stole some of their images. And also for members of SEAL team, I would like to organize a field trip up there someday. I think you'd enjoy it. I was kind of hoping to do it during the fall, the cooler weather, but it's starting to get colder, the leaves are down. But to see the covered bridge, to see the mill, the blacksmith shop, I think it'd be a nice outing for a day.
Count me in.
After May, please.
After May,
Hello, Bruce.
after May, it starts getting hot again.
Jim, I was curious about the bones underneath the floorboards, and I don't know whether about dating those, or I guess the thought is that some animal drug them in there and was eating in there, right?
Well, that's a possible explanation. And again, there was that vent. A lot of that bone came from the northwest corner, right, not far from where that vent was filled in. But pig mandibles are pretty big. It's hard to imagine a rat hauling that in. And also, again, when we look at it, if it's rats, they're going to have gnaw marks all over them. And I think I've probably seen a few, but not of that order. I think they're put there by people. Was it just part of some, were they just doing some filling and was just shoveling up stuff from somewhere? And it's hard to imagine people. I mean, pig mandibles are kind of hard to miss when you're shoveling. It's like, oh, let's throw this in there too. It's fill. But the one thing I've learned from doing work on 17th and 18th century sites is that people's sense and sensibility is very different from ours today. I talked about this one site some months ago in Bowie. We excavated a plantation site early to mid 18th century. There was a privy 50 feet from the main house. From what looked like they might have been slave quarters, the privies were even closer. In between the two buildings, there was a pit filled with a number of pits filled with all kinds of nasty smelling trash. There was a lamb buried, a lamb burial
Wow.
between the two buildings. It's like, we would never do that. I mean, in Western society, at least in North American society, we wouldn't do those sorts of things. It would just offend our sensibilities. And in the privies on that site, they would throw fine ash in from the fireplace, and that serves as a deodorant. It suppresses the odor, absorbs it. It's charcoal. So they weren't completely oblivious to it, but they weren't sufficiently sensitive about it to move their privies another 50 feet away and downwind. So, those are the kinds of things you learn when you dig a number of different sites. So when we come across one like this, and there's a bunch of trash from the early to mid 19th century, at least some of which must have smelled pretty bad, it's part of, something larger that typified society. Cindy?
How often did people bathe back then? Maybe their sense of smell was kind of dampened by the fact that everything stunk.
Yeah, the modern bathing habits is probably dates to what we call the Victorian era. Victoria, if you've seen any of the shows on PBS lately, in one of her, what was it, the Isle of Wight, she had a house. It had a shower set up as well as a bathtub. And these are not things we'd find early in the 19th century, much less earlier. Bathing was often considered effeminate. So, it was okay for women to do it, men doing it. It's like, and that sentiment exists today. You get a bunch of men between the ages of, let's say, 30 and 70 and ask them, how often do you take a bath? And most of them say, oh, I haven't taken a bath in years. I take showers because it's still considered effeminate.
It's about as often as they wash their sheets.
Oh, God.
God. Oh,
Yeah.
Sorry.
Cindy, you're
Yeah.
killing me.
One little additive on those bones, there wasn't anything like a complete skeleton there, though. They look to be
No.
similar bones of larger flesh tissue.
Yeah, some of them have been sawn or they're clear cut marks on them. No, this is flesh that's been eaten by humans. These are food remains from meals.
Wow. Even the rats?
No, no. Well, the rats, we didn't find any complete skeletons, but we found a lot of little, pieces and intact. A whole bunch of pelvises and a lot of femurs, and we can count them up. What's the minimum number of rats that were present based on a number of, say, left femurs that we find. So yeah, that's typical. When we do find rodents in archaeological deposits, we tend to find cranial pieces, the mandibles, and various other postcranial elements. Whereas with food remains, you'll find a massive beef rib and no other beef remains around it. So, I mean, and it's been sawn, so it's clearly food. So, I mean, we'll work out more of this when we do the fall analysis.
Could
See
it have been where they were rendering or butchering meat outside, and some of that was left on the ground and dragged in by animals?
These have, again, we haven't looked at it carefully, but a number of bones in there are clearly, they're final butchering. They're not, they're not hanging a body upside down on, and cutting it down the middle and cutting it into quadrants. These are cuts of meat, a number of them, except for the birds where we don't really do that. We tend to cook the bird whole.
Yeah.
So we'll have, most of the parts, they won't be extensively cut up. But with with pig, with sheep, with cow, with deer, if it's present, I don't think it is. You're going to be cutting these ham, you'll be cutting up into smaller pieces, and that leaves very telltale marks. So we'll see. But there's clearly, at least some of the stuff is so very clearly butchered. You would find it looks exactly like some of the stuff that show up on your own table if you're a meat eater.
Where would they have done the butchering?
My guess is they were buying it.
Uh,
This is the dwelling. Yeah, so they would be buying it from a local butcher or the store or whatever, maybe a farmer. I don't know.
Mm.
So I guess we're almost getting the bum's rush from Allison.
Hey, Jim,
So-
could you comment a little bit on
sorry.
the metal detection work and where that's going to go? Do you have any idea what was down there or?
Well, we did it because I wanted to do it because I want to convince the Maryland Historical Trust to do ground penetrating radar and magnetometry there, because it's a state property. With their procedures, they can justify working there. And what I've done is I've just shown, okay, there's clearly something here. And also that field very likely someday is going to become, a staging area for construction. It's going to continue. Maybe it'll continue for overflow parking. We should figure out what's there. And we do have an historic map that suggests there's a house there belonging to the Lee family. So yeah, it's just a way of sort of getting our foot in the door. Hey, let's go take a look at this field. Anything else, guys?